Elias Moreau stood by the bedroom window, watching rain streak down the glass like silent tears. Behind him, Celine's voice cracked with desperation, a sound he'd once have rushed to comfort, but now only deepened the hollow ache in his chest. "Why don't you want me anymore?" she whispered, her reflection ghostly in the darkened glass. He turned slowly, offering that quiet smile, the one he'd perfected over 18 months of swallowing hurt. "You gave away what was mine, Celine." Her face paled. We never. "Not your body," he interrupted gently. "Your heart, your thoughts, the intimacy we built for 12 years. He pulled his phone from his pocket, setting it on the dresser between them. "I found the messages 6 months ago. Every late-night conversation with Damien, every confession you should have shared with me, every piece of yourself you handed to him while I slept beside you." Celine's hands trembled. The messages had been emotional, deep confessions about her fears, dreams, frustrations with their marriage. Things she'd stopped sharing with Elias years before, redirecting that vulnerability to her colleague instead. "It wasn't physical," she managed. "No," Elias agreed, his voice steady despite the grief pooling in his eyes. "It was worse. You let another man become your emotional center while I became a stranger in my own marriage. You gave him the parts of yourself I'd been begging for, your trust, your laughter, your midnight thoughts." He remembered the night he'd discovered it, coming home early from a business trip, finding her on the balcony at 2 a.m., phone glowing against her face as she smiled at Damien's messages, the same soft smile she'd once reserved for Elias alone. "I wanted to fight," he continued, moving toward the door. "I wanted to rage and demand and beg you to choose me. But then I realized love shouldn't require begging for basic honesty. Romance dies the moment one person has to plead for what should be freely given." "Elias, please." "I've already moved my things to the guest house," he said quietly. "My lawyer will contact you tomorrow. I'm not angry, Celine. I'm just done mourning a marriage you abandoned long before I did." The door closed with a soft click, leaving Celine alone with the ghost of everything she'd carelessly given away.
3 years later, Elias had rebuilt himself, brick by brick. His architectural firm flourished in Montreal's Saint-Henri district, where he designed his own loft, all exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows that let light flood every corner, leaving no room for shadows or secrets. The divorce had been remarkably civil. Celine had cried through mediation, finally admitting the emotional affair had progressed further than she'd initially confessed. Damien had been a fantasy, she'd said, an escape from the mundane rhythms of married life. She'd wanted excitement without consequence, intimacy without accountability. Elias had signed the papers without bitterness, dividing their assets with mathematical precision. He'd kept the cabin in Tremblant, she'd kept their Montreal condo. Clean breaks, minimal contact. His days now followed a meditation of routine and purpose. Morning runs along the Lachine Canal, design work that challenged him intellectually, evenings reading philosophy on his terrace. Friends worried he'd become too solitary, too guarded. "You haven't dated anyone since the divorce," his business partner Rashid observed over drinks one November evening. Elias swirled his whiskey thoughtfully. "I'm not interested in filling empty space with temporary comfort. I spent 18 months feeling alone while married. I refuse to feel alone while with someone ever again." That's either profound wisdom or elaborate avoidance. "Perhaps both," Elias smiled. The truth was more complex. He'd been on dates, intelligent, attractive women who'd shown genuine interest, but he'd learned to recognize performative affection, the carefully curated versions people presented. He wanted something real, unguarded. He wanted someone who chose vulnerability as strength, not weakness. His phone buzzed. An email from the city's Arts Council about a new cultural center project. They wanted bold, unconventional designs. He pulled up his laptop, fingers already sketching preliminary concepts. This was his romance now, creation without compromise, building something meaningful from nothing. If love found him again, it would have to be as honest and solid as the structures he designed. Outside, Montreal's winter began its slow arrival, covering the city in pristine white, a blank canvas waiting for something beautiful to emerge.
The Arts Council presentation had been scheduled for December 15th. Ilias arrived early, portfolio under his arm, prepared to pitch his most ambitious design yet, a cultural center that merged traditional Moroccan architecture with modernist glass and steel, honoring his heritage while embracing innovation. She was standing by the concept wall when he entered, studying another firm's proposal with intense concentration. Naïva Sinclair wore a charcoal suit that suggested authority without severity, her dark hair pulled back to reveal a face marked by intelligence and something else, perhaps kindness, perhaps wariness. He couldn't tell which. "You're early," she said without turning, somehow aware of his presence. "I believe in respecting other people's time," Ilias replied, setting up his presentation materials. She turned then, offering her hand. "Naïva Sinclair, project director. Your preliminary sketches were extraordinary. That fusion of geometric Islamic patterns with structural glass is breathtaking." Her handshake was firm, brief, professional, but her eyes held his a moment longer than necessary, and he felt something shift. Not attraction exactly, but recognition, like meeting someone who spoke a language you'd thought was yours alone. The presentation went flawlessly. Ilias walked the council through his vision, spaces that honored cultural memory while creating room for new narratives. Naïva asked precise, challenging questions that demonstrated she'd studied his work deeply. "Why architecture?" she asked finally. "Most people choose it for aesthetics or ego. You approach it like therapy." Ilias smiled. "Because buildings outlive us. They're promises we make to the future about how space should feel. Safe, open, honest. I design spaces where people can be fully themselves." "And can you be fully yourself?" The question was bold, unprofessional even, but her tone held genuine curiosity rather than flirtation. "I'm learning," Ilias answered honestly. The council voted unanimously for his proposal. As they filed out, Naïva approached with 2 coffee cups. "Celebration or commiseration coffee?" she offered. "You tell me. You led the vote." "Celebration, obviously, though I'm buying coffee for purely professional reasons, you understand." "Of course," Ilias agreed, accepting the cup. "Strictly business." They talked for 2 hours in that conference room, conversation flowing from architecture to philosophy, to the peculiar loneliness of building things meant to last. She'd been divorced too, Naïva admitted, 3 years ago when her ex-husband chose his career over their marriage. "I used to think love meant sacrifice," she said quietly. "Now I think it means finding someone whose presence adds rather than subtracts." Ilias studied her carefully. "You don't trust easily." "Neither do you," she countered, meeting his gaze directly. "We both know what it costs to give yourself to someone who doesn't protect what you've offered." It wasn't romance yet, just 2 people recognizing shared wounds and similar healing. But when Ilias left that evening, her number saved in his phone with the notation, "Coffee sometime?" he felt something he'd thought impossible. Cautious hope. They moved slowly, deliberately. 2 people who'd learned that rushing toward intimacy often meant running away from honesty. Coffee became dinner, dinner became long walks along the frozen St. Lawrence River, conversations deepening with each shared story. Naïva told him about her marriage's slow death, how her ex-husband's ambition had gradually eclipsed everything else, leaving her feeling like a supporting character in someone else's story. She'd wanted partnership. He'd wanted an audience. When she'd finally asked for more, he'd accused her of being unsupportive. "I started believing him," she admitted one January evening, wrapped in blankets on Ilias's terrace, watching snow fall over the city. "Started thinking maybe I was asking too much. Maybe love was supposed to feel like constant accommodation."
Ilias's hand found hers beneath the blanket, their first intentional touch beyond polite handshakes. "What changed your mind?" "My grandmother," Neva smiled. "She said, 'A woman who shrinks herself to fit a man's comfort will eventually disappear.' So I stopped shrinking, filed for divorce, started over." "Do you regret it?" "Only that I didn't do it sooner." She turned to face him, breath misting in the cold. "What about you? Any regrets about Celine?" Ilias had shared his story over several conversations, carefully unpacking the layers of hurt and healing. Now he considered the question seriously. "I regret not recognizing the signs earlier, not trusting my instinct when I felt her pulling away. But I don't regret leaving. Staying would have meant accepting breadcrumbs and calling it a feast." "Beautifully put," Neva murmured, her free hand reaching up to trace his jaw. "You're very good with words. Only when they're true." She leaned closer, lips hovering near his. "Then tell me something true." "I'm terrified," Ilias whispered against her mouth. "Terrified of wanting this. Terrified of trusting again. Terrified that I'll wake up one day and find you've given pieces of yourself to someone else while I was busy believing we were whole." "Then I'll tell you something true," Neva breathed. "I'm terrified too, but I'd rather be afraid with you than safe and alone." The kiss was slow, exploratory, a question rather than a demand. Her lips tasted like peppermint and promise, her hands threading through his hair with gentle certainty. When they finally pulled apart, foreheads pressed together, Ilias felt something fundamental shift in his chest. This wasn't the desperate passion of his youth or the comfortable routine his marriage had become. This was deliberate choice, mutual respect, the careful architecture of building something meant to last. "Stay," Ilias murmured against her temple. "I thought you'd never ask."
Spring arrived with Naeva's things gradually migrating into Ilias's loft, books finding shelf space beside his, her art prints complementing his minimalist aesthetic, 2 coffee mugs permanently stationed by the machine. They'd waited 6 months before this step, both wary of rushing, both needing proof that this was different. It was. Naeva didn't hide her thoughts behind pleasant smiles. When something bothered her, she spoke directly, kindly, but without evasion. When Ilias pulled back into solitude during stressful projects, she gave him space without interpreting it as rejection. They argued sometimes, real disagreements about money and boundaries in the future, but they argued towards solutions rather than victories. "You know what's revolutionary?" Naeva said one morning in bed, sunlight streaming across tangled sheets. "That you actually listen when I talk, that you remember things I mention, that I don't have to translate my needs into hints and hope you decode them." Ilias pulled her closer, kissing her shoulder. "Revolutionary or just basic respect?" "In my experience, revolutionary." They made love slowly that morning, unhurried exploration of familiar territory that somehow still felt new. Her body beneath his was both sanctuary and adventure, every touch given freely, every response genuine. This was intimacy without performance, 2 people fully present, fully honest, fully alive. "I love you," Naeva whispered afterward, fingers tracing patterns on his chest. "And I know that's heavy, saying it. I know your history, but I need you to know I love you too." Ilias interrupted gently. "And I'm not afraid of those words anymore, not when they come with action to back them up, not when they're demonstrated every day in how we choose each other." The email came that afternoon. Celine's name in his inbox made Naeva glance up from her laptop with raised eyebrows. "Your ex?" "Apparently." Ilias opened it carefully. The message was long, raw, 3 years of therapy condensed into paragraphs of confession and regret. Celine had tried to rebuild with Damien, discovered the fantasy couldn't survive reality. She was sorry, so deeply sorry. She understood if Ilias couldn't forgive her, but she needed him to know she finally understood what she'd destroyed. "She wants to meet," Ilias summarized, "to apologize properly, to explain.
"Do you want to see her?" He looked at Naiva, really looked at her, at the woman who'd taught him that love wasn't about possession or performance, but presence and protection, at the partner who demonstrated daily that romance was action, not just words. "I'll meet her," he said slowly, "not for her sake, for mine, to close that chapter completely." They met at a cafe near Old Montreal, neutral territory. Celine looked older, careworn, her eyes carrying the weight of consequence. They talked for an hour, her apologies, her explanations, her admission that she'd sabotaged something irreplaceable because she'd been too afraid to do the work of sustaining it. "I see you're happy now," she said finally, having clearly looked him up online, seen photos of him and Naiva at the cultural center's opening. "I am," Ilias confirmed, "not because I found someone else, but because I found myself first. I learned that I deserve someone who chooses me consistently, not just when it's convenient." "She's lucky." "We both are," he corrected gently, "because we both chose to be. That's the difference, Celine. What we had, it died because you stopped choosing it. What I have now lives because we both choose it daily." When he left that cafe, walking back toward the loft where Naiva waited, Ilias felt the final weight lift. Not forgiveness exactly, more like release. Celine's choices had wounded him, yes, but they'd also freed him to find something deeper. Naiva was cooking when he arrived home, her presence in his space now feeling like it had always belonged there. "How'd it go?" she asked, handing him a glass of wine. "It went. It's done." He pulled her close, breathing in her familiar scent. "Thank you for not being jealous or insecure about me seeing her." "Why would I be?" Naiva smiled against his chest. "I'm not competing with your past. I'm building your future." That night, wrapped together in darkness, Ilias understood the difference between what he'd lost and what he'd found. His marriage had been built on expectation and obligation, slowly eroded by unspoken needs and broken promises. This, Naiva's steady breathing beside him, her complete trust, their shared commitment to honesty, this was built on choice, daily, conscious, deliberate choice. True romance, he realized, begins not when someone completes you, but when someone sees you completely and chooses to stay. Not because they need you, but because they want the specific shape of life that includes you. His wife once asked why he no longer wanted her. He smiled and said she gave away what was his. But the real truth, discovered only through time and healing, was simpler. She gave away what they'd built together: trust, intimacy, partnership. With Naiva, nothing was given away. Everything was invested, protected, and honored. And that made all the difference.